Go.
Hello and welcome to Writer Mother Monster. I'm your host, Lara Ehrlich, and our guest tonight is poet and mother Katie Peterson. Before I introduce Katie, I want to thank you all for tuning in and to let you know that you can now listen to Writer Mother Monster as a podcast on all major audio platforms or read the interview transcript at your leisure, all on writermothermonster.com. If you enjoy the episode, please consider becoming a Writer Mother Monster patron or patroness on Patreon. Your support helps make this series possible. Please also chat with us during the interview. Your comments and questions will appear in our broadcast studio, and we'll weave them into our conversation. Now, I'm excited to introduce Katie. Katie Peterson is the author of 4 collections of poetry, including A Piece of Good News. Her fable in lyric prose, Life in a Field, was selected by Rachel Zucker for the Omnidon Open Books Prize and will be published in April 2021. She has received fellowships from the Radcliffe Institute, the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She collaborates with her husband, the photographer Young So, and they have shown their work at the Mills College Art Museum and the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. Katie, Young, and their daughter Emily live in Berkeley, and Katie directs the MFA program in creative writing at UC Davis. Her daughter is 3, and she describes writer motherhood in 3 words as always play first. Welcome, Katie.
Hey.
Hi.
It's good to be here.
Oh, it's good to see you. We knew each other now many years ago when you were directing the creative writing program at Tufts University.
That's correct. Right before you did your graduate degree in writing.
That's right. So it's great to see you. And I know I introduced this a little bit, but tell us who lives in your house. So you're in Berkeley. Who lives with you there?
So the people who live in my house are me, my husband, Young Soo, who was born in Korea, came here to do an undergraduate degree at Pratt, and then ended up doing a graduate degree at the museum school, actually, Boston. He's a photographer. He also teaches at UC Davis. And our daughter, Emily, who was born October 12th, 2017. She was born in the middle of the Santa Rosa fires. Since then, we've had a number of fires in California. But the reason why I always remember that is my labor was very long. It was like 4.5 days. And I was already very late, and we could barely go outside, right? Because of the smoke. And the great thing is we were in a hospital and we were protected from the smoke. But the bad thing was it was really like being in a dark tunnel for that whole time. And then when we drove Emily home from the hospital, we were driving down one of the streets on the way to our house, and it's like a suburban street, like 3 blocks away from the highway. And a stag crossed the road, like this beautiful stag, just like right in front of our car. And it had, I think, been driven down from the hills by the fires. And we were sitting there in the car with Emily, and this stag crossed the road in the regular suburban street. It was incredible.
Yeah, talk about metaphors.
Right?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. So if you're comfortable with it, can you talk about what you mean by the labor being a long 4 days is pretty intense?
Yeah, it was, it's fun to talk about. I mean, what an experience. And then I don't think people like, we haven't domesticated the experience of labor or childbirth enough that we all talk about it all the time. I think I was 41.5 weeks, and they had let me go that long because I was perfectly healthy, and the doctor was indulging my desire for a natural pregnancy. But finally they induced me, and nothing worked, right? Like, they did every single intervention under the sun to get Emily to come out. But when they finally did a C-section at like 5 a.m. or something. So probably there are some other mothers listening who know that the experience of taking a childbirth class is sometimes completely and totally useless to you. And that's what was true for me. Finally, they did this C-section and she came out. But the other thing that was true was that my doula kind of went AWOL. And so it was really my husband there with me. He did not sleep. like ever. I barely slept and he did not sleep. And he was really, really good at it. And all of the nurses in the ward would come through and they'd be like, "Who's your doula? How did you get a male doula?" They all thought he was the doula, right?
Oh my
He was
gosh.
just really like, so I think I fell in love with him all over again through that experience.
Oh my gosh. Now, I don't know much about your husband since I don't know if you knew him back when I first met you, but can you talk about how you met Young and tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, sure. We met at Yaddo. We had the art colony love affair.
Oh.
And we met right before I think I met you. And I think of him as an introverted personality. And when we first met, I really admired the way he took pictures because there was so much quiet around his person. And there was this combination between being really relaxed and being really precise, which is very much a part of his pictures.
Mhm.
He did a series of pictures about the wildfires in California that have been exhibited a number of times. This was all from the 2008 and then the 2013 wildfires, but they're haunting because now this is just a part of our lives. It's not something unusual. And his eyes were on them, trying to reckon with the fact that he thought they were very beautiful. And he tends to find beauty in things that I think feel destructive or feel dangerous. And his photographs of the California landscape and of the American national parks to me are very unique because he finds the whole American nature thing really terrifying. And for me, it's been such a central thing about my poetry and about writing American landscape and the West, kind of trying to bring a feminine voice to the West.
Mhm.
He loves those landscapes too, but they're terrifying to him. And so there's this aspect of the sublime in his pictures that I really admire.
Wow, yeah. No, you actually hit on the next question I had because, like you said, your poetry very much deals with the land and nature and those quiet spaces that can contain deep emotion like fear or desire. So, can you talk a little bit now about your poetry? Just tell us, for those who have not yet read you, had the pleasure of reading you, tell us about your books and what inspires you.
Yeah. So it's hard to start with one thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel when I look at my own work, like a combination between a classic American nature poet and a sexy metaphysical like John Donne. And
Yeah.
I think the poems have landed in landscape because I grew up in the West, but by temperament and character, I'm like a thinky Bostonian, and I
Mhm.
loved living there because I had that fast-paced neurosis. I remember
Mhm.
at some point at a dinner party in Boston, I talk really fast, right? I talk much faster than people in California, and here I'm often mistaken for an Easterner, though I know what I am. And I remember at this dinner party in Boston, someone looked at me and said, "Did you know that Massachusetts Avenue is the fastest street in the country?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And this person said, "When I heard you talk, I thought everyone who's walking down Mass Ave in Boston talks as fast as that. You must be from here." And I looked it up the next day, and it's true. The pace of people walking in Mass Ave in Cambridge is it's faster than New York. They've clocked it, right?
Oh, wow.
And so it's like I really relate to that sense of the intensity of being in your head during a northeastern winter. And a lot of the poets I love, like Elizabeth Bishop, are so Yankee in some way, or they have that Eastern sense of texture and intensity and complexity and depth.
Mhm.
Um, and that's all true, but I grew up around the airy landscapes of California and the big vistas of the Sierra Nevada. So I think of those things as coming together in the work. And likewise, I think that, especially in recent work, but in the last book, A Piece of Good News, I really wanted to bring together things we think of as extremes of the inner life, like desire and fear and contemplation, and these irreducible aspects of our public and political existence, like thinking about who the president is, or thinking about the future, or what it feels like to be in an urban space, thinking about rural spaces, or vice versa. There are a lot of poems in A Piece of Good News that take place in a rural space, but the character is thinking about an urban space. And there's a long poem that is very much takes place in an urban space, which is all about ranging across the rural spaces in the country.
What was it like moving back from Boston to Berkeley?
It was a shock.
Yeah.
It was the hardest thing I think I've ever done. Besides grieve, in a way, like it really was a shock. And I moved for incredible reasons. I moved because I loved someone, and because I wanted to have a child, and because I got a tenure track job at a wonderful school with writers that I really admire, all these great reasons. But I left behind the best friends I've ever had, and the city where I first became an independent person. And I think specifically of my best friend, who a poet, the poet Sandra Lim, who I was my everyday person. And for the first year that I was in California, I can't tell you how I mourned her not living down the street from me. It was really difficult. And now I think of it and I think, wow, what a thing that you could live to love someone that much. But at the time I thought, what the hell am I doing? Like, why did I do this? You know? And it was really like a feeling of being unmoored. And when I think about it, I think it descended first on a kind of as a kind of panic. Like, what am I about here? How do I belong here? And the other thing I realized as the months went on was it had so much to do with confronting the person I had been, because I grew up in Menlo Park on the peninsula and had lived my whole life there until I went to the East Coast. And so now the idea in my life is I'm supposed to live integrated with my childhood self and my relatives. Like, I'm supposed to live an hour away from my dad and be okay with it. Like, what? Like, that was all not what I had planned for my life in a way. So I think it was really to be raising a child in essentially the place where I grew up is nothing I ever anticipated doing.
You know, I'm right there with you, having moved back to Connecticut now 15 minutes from where I grew up with my 4-year-old daughter. It's interesting. And you see people that you went to high school with at the grocery store, or used to before the pandemic. And it's sort of like, oh, I never really wanted this to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think writers too, I certainly wouldn't be the first writer to move to a new place and gain a new persona, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to then sort of have to sort of be the person I was before I was a writer and the writer self at the same time. Well, that's been weird. You know?
So tell me about that self before you became the writer self. And then we'll get to the self you became once you became a mother. But who is former Katie, and now who is writer Katie, and now who is like Berkeley Katie?
Yeah, right. I don't know. Who was that person? I mean, you know, it's hard for me to say who I was. I guess it's easier to talk about what the world felt like at that time, right? Because I think the world felt different. Like, I grew up in the 80s in California, and the California that we think of is a place fueled by the .com boom, where it's too expensive to live and where income inequality has like torqued out community to mean that billionaires live in the same zip codes as the homeless. And there was boom bust here when I was growing up, but it was definitely more of an ordinary place, I'd say. And it felt beautifully far away from other places in the country, like unique and special far away. And there were so many open spaces. So all these neighborhoods here where there are now McMansions were empty lots, or there would be some lady, you know, with chickens in her backyard or things like that. There was still a wildness even about the most sedate neighborhoods. And I think that place has changed. And that sense of smallness has changed. You know, I grew up in a Catholic family, and we all went to Catholic schools, and yet like everyone I knew was some form of a progressive Democrat, right? Like, what world is there still that world somewhere? I don't know. Like, the world has changed, and we've changed with it. I know that when I went to the East Coast, one of the things that really changed me was living in a city, right? Because even California's cities don't really feel like cities in a way. And I think there is something about living in a city that lets you think about being a political self, like living in a community with others really publicly, even if you don't know them and even if they're anonymous to you. Coming back to California, this weird land of faux homesteaders, I see all the cracks in political community here and all the difficulties we have in California coming together on things. There are other things we do really well, but I think about that a lot. Why it's so hard for people to come together here,
Yeah.
and the strange mixture between the rural and the urban.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about, so you mentioned what you had sort of expected your life to look like. Did you have, what did you expect your life as a mother would look like?
Well, so, I think it's important to say my mother died in 2008 and I miss her every day. And when she died, she had cancer and she died. She didn't get as many years as we all would have liked for her to have. And when she died, I was filled with two twin senses. The first, this feeling that I would never be a mother. And the second, this incredible hunger to be a mother. And I lived in that really divided state mentally for like 3 years, right? Because I hadn't found the partner. And the summer before I met Young, I had basically decided that I was going to have a baby on my own and had made plans to do it. I'd saved the money to do it. And I had a whole thing about it. I think I was 38 or something like that. And then I met Young. And all of a sudden, this thing that I both thought was impossible and I really wanted became possible in the eyes of another person who also was like a man, right? Like it was like so strange that it happened. So I think it's less that I had a fixed idea of my destiny than I had gotten to the point where I didn't think that a traditional life with like kids in a house in the suburbs was what I was kind of going to be looking at. And I had such good friends then and still do, that my sense of being loved was quite vibrant and was already imagining ways in which I could continue to feel loved, right, without being married or having a family. And so no one was more surprised than me, but it was also something I think I really wanted.
Yeah. Was there much conversation or was it something Young wanted to, and it was sort of like, okay, we found our person, now we'll make this happen?
I think he was very surprised at how much wanting to have kids with me was a part of the initial discussion. He's the one who brought it up. And he, like, that's the way he saw it. He wasn't interested in dating me, right? He was interested in something grander. And what was for me, noteworthy about that is, like, I'm in the middle of trying to decide how honest to be, right? Like, you see it on my face, like all
That's
the
up to you. You
decisions
be
I'm
honest.
making. But I think many of my women friends at the time, including me, were having disappointing encounters with men of our generation who had complicated feelings about what they called settling down, right? I think of it as a hallmark of my generation that people feel complicated feelings about those things. I actually think my students who I'm teaching in their 20s, they feel something else. Like they don't always want a traditional life. But I don't think of the men that I teach in their 20s, and the men that I've taught, and I stayed close to a lot of my students and I know them pretty well, as like this population of men that me and all my friends seem to be dating for like 10 years. And I don't think they meant anything bad by it. I just think we were raised in a generation with a lot of ambivalence about family. And then I met someone from another country, right, from Korea, and family is so important there. He was able to sort of combine a really traditional understanding of that with the wholly new self that he had to be in this country. And he's an artist. So he doesn't see boundaries as fixed. He sees them as super complicated. And so it was not the first time, but the most significant time I was ever able to talk to someone I was in love with about what having a child with them would be like and mean. And then, in the years since then, I've talked to all these people I know who are married and have kids, and they were like, oh yeah, we talked about that early on, or, oh yeah, like that was, especially people I know who are religious, right? I think that's like conditioned as part of it. But somehow those just weren't the people I met when I was doing the poet thing for like 10 years. And then I got really lucky and I met the right person.
Mm-hmm. No, I've heard that from so many people. You're not alone in that. I've heard from many of my friends also who were dating, in their 20s and 30s, these men who, as you've said, just sort of are ambivalent about not just family, but about career, about really like a future and kind of like what a future could look like. It was sort of this like very um, sense of like, I live in the present and I don't want to think about,
Yeah,
10 years out. To be fair, there are probably a lot of women in our generation who feel that way too.
I think that's true.
I don't know any of them, but probably
Oh
exist.
yeah. I mean, I think I was one
Yeah.
probably for a lot of that time.
Mhm.
Yeah, like I definitely think that I didn't always like date people with the future in mind, but I
Mhm.
do remember the time it changed for me. I was dating somebody and we were kind of talking about what the future would look like. And this person was like, well, I don't really want to think about the future. And I remember it coming to my head as a statement, this is really boring,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
It's really boring. Like, and I think I said to the person, I think that would be really boring for me to keep dating you without talking about the future. And I think about my daughter when I think about this, because I think my mother didn't talk to me enough about this kind of stuff. Like
Mhm.
my parents were like they were so much in love. I think they loved each other so much, and they were so generous with each other's foibles
Mhm.
that it was like both a great model and a terrible one, because like I think marriage is for real. Like I have this great marriage in my imagination, but I also like I think my mother had no other advice than like deal, right, in a way. And I could have used more advice. I could have used
Yeah.
more.
What was it about her passing so was it because she passed away that you then felt such a hunger to become a mother yourself, or was that something that had been brewing for a while and came to a head?
I literally didn't think about it until she died.
Really?
Like, yeah, and then like I had to like talk to my therapist about that. My therapist was like, "You didn't ever think about it." And I was like, "Yeah." Like I really really didn't. I
Mhm.
think I thought I'd think about it later.
Mhm.
I think I thought I'd think about it later, and then all of a sudden it is later, right?
Mm.
But you don't realize it's becoming later. And I think first I didn't think about it. I felt like a sorrow. I felt this great sorrow that my mother was going to die and she was never going to see children that I was going to have.
Mhm.
And that was this experience I wasn't going to get to have, you know. And
Yeah.
I also just felt, I don't think I thought about it consciously like that. I actually think I thought about it like it came to me. I remember waking up when my mother was really at the end, waking up at 4 a.m. and thinking, I need to have a child immediately with anyone,
Wow.
you know.
Yeah.
It was in some ways I think of it as the first biological feeling I had in some ways too, like
Mhm.
because something that I've thought about a lot in the last year is whether to have another baby.
Mhm.
And I don't know whether you had this experience, but it was like as soon as Emily was 2.5 and getting really oppositional, like everything in me was like, obviously I need to have another baby. And it almost felt biological. Like I actually love just being the parent of one child, but
Mhm.
it seemed to come into my dreams and into my thinking and into all these other aspects of my life, like as a thought and as a conversation, almost without me even. I didn't think about it rationally. I think it came from my body.
I love that, and I want to talk about that more because maybe you and I are alike in that I am very much an intellectual person who doesn't pay attention to my body pretty
Oh yeah,
regularly. And
yeah.
so motherhood was never like a biological thing for me either. I never sort of felt the urge to become a mother. It was a lot of like then conversation and thinking and talking to my therapist and all these things about like, should I become a mother? What are the pros and cons of becoming a mother? And like finally it was like, okay, well, either we're going to do it or we're not. So we'll just do it and
Hmm.
then hopefully it'll turn out okay. So like to hear you talking about this biological hunger for motherhood is so fascinating. And I wonder if you could talk about that and how it kind of works in tandem or against maybe the intellectual side of you, the side that creates, that parses words and creates structures within language.
So the thing that's coming to my mind is the 9 months of pregnancy and the months right after it,
Mhm.
and the way that all these things happen in your body that you can't refuse, right? You can't refuse the heartburn, you can't refuse contractions, you can't refuse back pain. Um, and then all that stuff happens during pregnancy, and then you have a baby, and then you have to you're supposed to breastfeed that thing, which is so crazy. And and talk about an experience that's both biological and intellectual, right? Because there are all these biological things happening, but your brain, I think, can't help but reflect on the strangeness of the experience. And also, so much of it is about whether it works or not. And as soon as you're involved in something that may or may not work, like you're involved in your intellect in some way. And I remember saying to somebody in the months after the pregnancy, and also the way you're hungry, right? So you're really hungry while you're pregnant, and then you have the baby, and when you're breastfeeding, you're really hungry. And I remember saying to somebody, somebody said to me, some Berkeley person said to me, well, it must be really nice to feel so close to your body. And I said to the person, I said, I live here. And when this is over, I'm coming back here.
Yeah.
And the person looked at me like I was like a horror.
Uh-oh. Looks like we lost Katie. We'll wait for her to come back. But in the meantime, as we're waiting for Katie to come back, I see some comments and questions coming in. Katie Ford sounds like she's a longtime friend of Katie Peterson. She says, I can tell you that Katie was essentially just like this herself entire 22 years ago when I met her. Katie, I'm just reading some of the great comments that have come in while we waited for you to come back.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I was saying it sounds like a childhood friend is here, Katie Ford, who says that you have essentially been just like this yourself entire 22 years ago when you met. So that's nice to see. Please keep the comments and questions coming. And Katie, let's pick up where you left off here.
Yeah,
The intellect, going back to the intellect.
Yeah. And I definitely think you asked a little bit about having the baby, right? Like what it meant intellectually or biologically. And I feel like I want to go back and kind of correct or edit myself and say, I know that there's this thing people talk about a biological clock ticking. And just to be clear, I was 42 when I had Emily. And I think that surely was part of it. But I think that the part of us that dreams is also the part of us that uses language. And I think that language is all mixed up, not just in our subjective responses, but in everything else we do. We use it for everything. We use it for politics. We use it for religion. We use it for family. We use it for our work. And so Katie says, I can tell you she was essentially just like this. It is that thing. The way you do one thing is the way you do everything, right? Or the way and I think there was no way I was going to have carry a baby and then give birth to it without being ruminative, conceptual, right? Philosophical, desiring of making generalizations about the experience, kind of idiosyncratically obsessed with what was most kind of conceptual at the root of the experience. I like in my poems to play around with abstractions. The other day, I wrote a poem in which I talked about God, money, and power. And I look back at it and I thought, I really have come into my own if I've let myself write a 12-line poem in which I use the words God, money, and power. And I do remember when I was pregnant, an abiding interest in all of those conceptual matters kind of mapped onto the experience, Don't worry, I was also just super sleepy all the time. I had those biological reactions.
Totally.
But I remember having terrible contractions in the hospital and trying to write in my journal like this, and Young took it away from me, and he's like, you're not supposed to be lying on your back while you have contractions. And I was like, oh, sorry, I relied on him a lot.
I've heard other moms, including myself, say that they had grand plans of cataloging the experience, both of pregnancy and then childbirth, and then like those early days and like breastfeeding, all that stuff. And I had the grandest plans of like, documenting it all in my journal so I could come back to it later in literature. And like, I did not write a single word probably until Emmy was a couple weeks or maybe even a few months old. Were you able to, so you say Young took the journal out of your hands, but were you able to write when you were pregnant and then during those first early weeks?
I'm trying to think.
Hard to think back, yeah.
I wrote 2 or 3 poems that I bet will find their way into a next book if it happens. Like, but for the most part, I wrote notes and things in my journal that I'm glad I wrote down, but that were not in the form of poetry, And, so I was thinking, I have a student right now who's a mom. She's a first-year poetry student, and she's a mom, and she has 2 kids. And she's been writing these poems that are very interrupted. Like they have lots of backslashes and dashes and everything. And she just wrote one, and I didn't think it was very successful. And then we talked about it, and I said to her, I think there's an idealism sometimes around motherhood that everything about it, right? That like you could write poems about pregnancy while you're pregnant, that you could write poems about childbirth while you're having the baby. One person can. Rachel Zucker did, in the Last Clear Narrative, a wonderful book. And but for the most part, that's not how my mind works. Like I need distance from the experience to talk about the experience. And so it less had to do with like, so, and the thing is about like being pregnant and then having a little baby is I wasn't interested in thinking about another time in my life. When I think about it, I think it was the time in my life that I was most interested in thinking about the time right before me. Right.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether what I'm trying to say is that the writing of poetry sometimes relies on being in one time thinking about another. And there was something utterly present about a lot of that time that I was experiencing. I think that when Emily was asleep as a baby, I really longed for that to be a wonderful time to write poems. And I sometimes sat with a notebook and tried and really wanted to be in the moment of the poem in those moments. But I wasn't, I'd still like to write about those things as that happened, but I'd like to write about them tumbled into my other experiences, like I'd be like interested in 10 years to write a poem about the day I had Emily and try to remember and reconstruct that day. I think it might get interesting to me later.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, it's true. And I think like you said, not just with poetry too, in fiction as well, I think you often the distance from those important events can make for stronger writing rather than being in the midst of it and trying to piece together a narrative. I did the same thing. I sat with my notebook and tried to write while Emmy was sleeping, and then you kind of fall asleep, or that's your one chance to take a shower, and like, writing doesn't really take the precedence there.
And I think it still happens to me, right? So the other day, I've been working on I've been trying to write an essay about the Republican senators and why they're so evil, basically. Like kind of why, like I wanted to write an essay. I wanted to write something about self-respect. Like what, like I look at them and I think, well, you've lost your self-respect. And so I've been writing this essay. And I think with prose, I really feel it. And I wanted to talk to you about this because poetry can sometimes be a fragment. But when you're trying to write a piece of prose, let's say it's like 5,000 words, and you lose track of something, there could be a thought there and you can lose it, right? Like motherhood can actually make you lose it. And the thing that I've been trying to tell myself is, but it's here somewhere. So I may just have to jog the thought back by doing something like washing my hands or taking a shower or doing the laundry or doing something else. And just the other day, I had a thought. There are 2 places that I think right now. One is in the shower and one is driving Emily home from after I drop Emily off at daycare, coming home on my own, right? Because now I work at home. And in those 2 moments, there is usually a thought that has to do with the thing I'm trying to write. And I lost the thought when I came home because her teacher called me because I'd forgotten something that she needed at school. And I spent the next hour trying to get the thought back. I couldn't get it back. And so I finally gave up and I went to put a little laundry in and it came back. And when I was right after Emily had been born, I felt like that constantly. Like I'd have a thought and I'd lose it completely. And the thoughts were all wandering around somewhere in me, but I couldn't find them. And it really drove me crazy.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely felt that way too. And I still feel that way. Like when I'm driving or showering, those are the 2 times, I think because you can't do anything else.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? And so like your brain is like sort of occupied with this task, and then it's a very physical task. And then like you can kind of in the background be thinking about something else, and that's when it sort of rises up to the surface. So I definitely feel that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. We have a question here from Brittany O'Duffy. Thank you for questions. Brittany says, I would love to hear you all expound on the animal. There's a visceral element of these primal experiences, yes. But how does or did that inform your creative narratives? That is a great question.
I think you should answer it first. You wrote a book called Animal Wife.
True. Well, I'll give you a short answer because I really want to go back to you, Katie. But yes, I'm very interested in the animal and the visceral sort of bodily aspect of being not just a mother, but a woman. Because I feel like it's something that as we grow up, we are afraid of or taught to ignore the parts of our bodies that are animal, right? Like the hair, like we shave the hair out from our armpits and our legs. And um, the menstrual cycle is something that we're sort of ashamed of or that we sort of hide when it's happening. And all of these things that animals in the wild experience, but that we as women are taught to sort of keep tamped down. That when you become a mother, is the most vulnerable I've ever felt, being like, you know, immobilized on a table with pain and with this very animal experience of giving birth. And that's when there's blood and there's, you know, just all the things that we're taught not to talk about are suddenly laid bare in childbirth. And then that time afterward too, with like breast milk, and it's like all these fluids and things, and you're sort of torn open in a very animal way. So yeah, that definitely impacted my writing after becoming a mother. I found this sort of new interest in bodies and in the physical side and the animal side of our being. So that's the short answer for me, but I want to turn it back to Katie and ask you that same question. It's a great one.
It's interesting because these things are hard to look at in ourselves. And then you're looking at a child, and I think they're easier to look at in the child. And the child, I don't know whether your child is like this, but I bet they are. Like Emily is really fascinated with animals, right? All children are, right? And for her, the world of animals is daily. It's moment by moment, constantly checking in with what animal does she feel like, what animal does she want to be, which animals are around. Like she likes to call us animals, and she'll say, I'm a baby alpaca. Are you a mama alpaca? Right. And she goes through the animals. And so I think it's kind of interesting that I think that's true. I think we have all these reserved feelings about thinking ourselves as animals, but never in my life have I thought more about another person as an animal than having a little girl. And right now she's in what I read in the books is a stage that a lot of kids go through, which is really wanting to reunite with my body. And
Mm.
I don't mean to say that idealistic, I'm not what do I want to say, like that there's something that sounds really sanctified about that. I don't mean that. Like, so when she was a little baby, I always found her very independent. She didn't love breastfeeding. She loved, definitely since the beginning, has been just as attached to her father as to me. She wasn't that cuddly of a baby to me in a way. She was independent even then, almost a little bit like arch or like almost like she likes to examine things from a distance, you know, but in the last 2 or 3 months, she has become like, she will sleep, she goes to sleep in her own bed, and then she wakes up at 3 or 4 in the morning and comes into ours and literally wants to sleep on top of me every single night, and wants to be in my lap all the time. And my lap, right? Just not any part of my body, but like my lap, this part, right? This part, she wants to just be here all the time. It's so mammalian, right? It's like, it's so intense. And I also can feel or think that she wants that because it's going away, right? So she always, I want baby alpaca, your mama alpaca. Well, she's also a little girl now. She's 3. She can do letters, like, almost, you know, like she's becoming a grown up. And so the animal in her is in time. It's moving forward in time. And I'm so glad we're talking about animals, because my next book, Life in a Field, is dedicated to my friend Bridget and her dog Violet, and also to animals and girls. So the dedication is for Bridget and Violet, for animals and girls. And I dedicated it to Bridget and Violet because Bridget has been my good friend for so long. And also because she's the person who's shown me what a relationship with an animal in its most beautiful form can look like. And I've been really educated by that, not being a dog person really myself. And I wanted to dedicate it to animals and girls because there's a kind of vision in the book of what would the world be if we divided it up into animals and girls and not into men and women. Like, what if we sort of redrew the lines and instead just thought, okay, who in a situation is an animal and who in a situation is a girl? And the vulnerability in animals and girls is accompanied in both cases, I think, by I guess I would call it aggression, right? Like, a really being able to see the aggression of other creatures. And in the story that I wrote, a girl and a donkey become very good friends, but then they have to marry time. And the last section of the book is the marriage ceremony, in which the girl and the donkey each decide to marry time. And both characters, the girl and the donkey, have a kind of aggressive part of themselves that they have to find a way to deal with. And it strikes me that one of the things that animals model for us is like dealing with the consequences of our impulses, as opposed to hiding the idea that we ever had them, right? Living not at one with ourselves, but living always in struggle. And I've grown to love dogs. I'm really not a dog person, but I've grown to love them because they're so attuned to the moment, and because all of their hungers for people, for order, for food, they experience without shame. And that it's an interesting way of coping with being mortal. Not our way, but an interesting way.
Yeah, I wonder when all of that kicks in with small children, because everything you've described with dogs and with animals is very similar, I think, to at least my experience with my daughter, that there is that lack of shame early on about bodies and about wanting to be in your lap and wanting to, you know, be close skin to skin and all of that. And not curbing impulses and so on. And so we sort of teach kids how to curb those impulses, and hopefully in a not damaging way, but that's tricky in and of itself, I feel like.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. How are you? So I'm interested in this because my daughter, who is a year older, is 4, went through that stage, and then she became independent again and slept in her own bed for a good long time. But then only recently, in the last couple, maybe the last month or so, has insisted on sleeping in our bed again. And in part, I think, or at least she says it's because she's lonely and she doesn't want to sleep alone. And how do you tell a 4-year-old during a pandemic that she has to sleep alone and, like, you know, she doesn't get to go to school or any of those things with other kids? So we've sort of gone back to all sleeping together in this bed, which feels, again, very much like she's trying to recapture something, right? Something that's sort of she's moving away from. So my train of thought here, what was it? Oh, with girls particularly, and trying to instill a sense of like boundaries and ownership of your body and all of these things. How are you thinking about that with Emily and with her desire to be close to you and to be in your lap? And she's still 3, so she's pretty little. Emmy is becoming 4, and we're starting to have those conversations about like, no, this is mommy's, body. You can't play with this part of my anatomy, for example, without going into too much detail.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, back to you.
I mean, I haven't had to do that yet.
Yeah,
I just let her do whatever she wants
yeah,
within reason,
within
you know?
reason. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't had to do that yet, but I also think I didn't breastfeed for that long. So there are things she doesn't do, and I actually think there are things she doesn't do. I
Hmm.
will there be a point in which she's too clingy? So far, Emily Sue has been um pretty independent of a person.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder whether she will direct her attentions towards that independence again when it's appropriate. And the thing I was also going to say is, you asked me how I was thinking about it.
Hmm.
So one way in which I'm helped in thinking about it is that she goes to a really great Montessori daycare where they talk to them about the integrity of their bodies and not letting other people into their spaces if they don't feel comfortable. It's like incredible how much she knows about that. All the stuff she knows about it, I didn't know until I was like 25.
Yeah.
So I think she's being raised in a different time in a different world. And I think she has a different sense of her body
Hmm.
than I kind of think I probably lived without an independent sense of my body from my mother's for longer than she's going to.
Wow. So to go back for a second, we touched on this with the animal conversation, but how has becoming a mother changed your work? So we talked about having that sort of narrative distance from the actual act of giving birth, but how have you seen Emily and the experience of being a mother changing your poetry and your prose?
Okay, so I feel like one of the things that there's so many things that how do I start? Like, I want to start in like 5 different places.
Sure.
I don't think we have a great sense in our culture right now about what it means to grow up.
Hmm.
Um, we underrate growing up. Many of us don't want to grow up. I'm sure as soon as I'm saying that, there are people listening to this who are like, ew, gross, grown-ups, I hate them, right? And definitely that's how I felt, like, and
Hmm.
still feel, right? Like being a grown-up is kind of fundamentally kind of a bad thing. And like, who are the models for really good grown-ups? Like Obama, that's it. Like it's hard to think of that many Dolly Parton and
Yes,
Obama are really good grown-ups. But
those
there
are
aren't
good ones.
there aren't
Yeah.
that many, like um and I do think there's something about parenthood, and I wouldn't confine it to motherhood, which has to do with putting someone else in front of you, right? That you have to.
Mhm.
There's I was raised a Catholic. The spiritual work of selflessness is at the center of many monastic and religious traditions. And I think that doing that changes you because it gives you some authority over life experience and also over things that you can't always tell to somebody. You can't always tell the truth to everyone all at once. That's something I think
Mhm.
about all the time about being a mother. I can't tell Emily the truth. I can't reason with Emily about everything. I can't like Emily and I can't stand in the rational truth of things when she doesn't want me to park in a certain place and throws a temper tantrum.
Mhm.
And I think as a writer, knowing how and when to tell the truth, right? Dickinson said, tell all the truth, but tell it slant, success in circuit lies. Like knowing that the truth is something that cannot be dropped on the page unceremoniously, but is its own difficult animal, needs to be cajoled and sometimes restrained. And I think of that as being something that motherhood has made me think about a lot, is how many of my own feelings I now must repress And likewise, how many of the things I'd like to say, I have to repress. And that wisdom, when I think about the history of it from literature, it's not a woman that I think about, it's Odysseus from the Odyssey, who more than once sat and through tears listened to a story that he couldn't react to.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing has made me think about that more than this pandemic and also the political situation. And I think, so the week of the election, Young and I were both on our phones and going crazy and texting people. And Emily was also going crazy and like unmanageable, right, by the day after the election. And of course she was. Her parents were completely out to lunch. Like, we weren't good enough or selfless enough to put aside that to just be with her, right? I'm sure there are other parents who are much better than us than that. But that proved my point in a way to myself, which was, because as soon as something comes into you as a parent, it's part of your child's life too.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about being a grown up, being a mother, I think about being a grown up. And when I think about being a grown up, I think about being so attached to others that what you do and say and eat and feel matters in such an embodied way to somebody else, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's true if you're not a mother, but it's come into relief for me as a result of being one.
Yeah, that leads into another question I had for you, was about taking the time to write and how you balance motherhood with like the logistics of writing. And I've heard others say the same thing that you were just talking about, that the being present with their child is being sometimes as being so important, but sometimes impossible. Like during the election, my husband and I were also similarly consumed with the news. So writing is another time in which you need to be consumed with something other than your child. And how do you balance those two all-consuming things in your life?
You don't balance them, you unravel. You do it by any means necessary, right? You are constant. I feel like I'm constantly letting my ideas go, my idea of how the day is supposed to go in light of how the day really is. And you have to be educated by that, right? If there's something more at stake than writing, you have to be with the fact that there's something more at stake than writing. And sometimes there is. You know, I'm good at making use of small bits of time, and always have been. I'm glad I have that. But it's also true that at this point in my life, I don't think I'm interested in being type A or neurotic about getting my writing time in. I'm not sure. We'll see. The jury's not out, but the jury's still out. But I don't know whether I'm the kind of person who could get up to finish a project every morning early. But maybe I will be at a certain point. It just hasn't worked for me that way. What has worked for me in terms of being able to get my writing time, like, I really think that's where Young and I we're living one life together, right? And for both of us to be right with our work, we have to be right with each other. It's like a whole system. And I know it works differently for different people, but for me, that's been really crucial. And I would say the second thing is you mentioned, driving in the shower.
Mm-hmm.
I really had kind of given up hope this spring of really writing any poems this year. And then I started going for walks. And on these walks, I started like this poem kind of came. And then it was like I had to go on the same walk every day for like, I still go on it because there might be a poem on the walk. And I've become very rigid about this walk that I go on because there might be a poem on the walk. And I don't have that many non-negotiables, right? But that has become this kind of weird non-negotiable thing. And so Young and I, we get together and we talk about our non-negotiable things that we need to do in order to feel like we're still working. And I also, just to be fair, my friend Karen Moore just wrote in the comments that she was almost 46 when Jesse, her son, who was my student at Deep Springs and who's more than just doing well, is an extraordinary person. I was lucky to have Emily and I late because I had tenure when I had her, right? Like there are things that I didn't have to worry about,
Mhm.
and that's just fortune that gave me that. So it still happens to me, like I was saying, like I'll be like writing a poem. Like I was standing in the bathroom writing a poem on my note function on my phone, right?
Mhm.
Like, and Young and Emily came in and they were like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "I'm writing a poem." And they were like, "Why?" And I was like, "You guys, like, you're supposed to know me better than anyone. Like, get out of the bathroom and let me write." But they don't interact with me that way, right? Like,
Mhm.
and that's so interesting. But when you asked me for 3 words, I said always play first. And
Mhm.
something that I've also discovered this year is if I'm not right in my relationship with Emily, then it's pretty hard for me to write a poem that I care about.
Mhm.
Um, doesn't mean that I have to be freaked out about my relationship with Emily. I think I'm actually a pretty chill parent, but it's not like I have yet to have the experience that I know a lot of mothers have, which is having to sacrifice something
Mhm.
with their child in order to get their work done. But poets are lucky we don't get anything done. We just don't. Like, I think writing a novel must feel very different, or a book of essays, or an academic book. We're wasters. We're the wasters of culture, right? So we beautifully waste time and it comes out and it does the work of justice. But like it's a mysterious and weird thing. The life of a poet is a lifelong like dare that it meant anything, you know? And I am just in the middle of that big dare. Like I jumped out of a plane and I'm still in the jump. I just have really cute company, this little goblin, Emily and Young.
I had other questions lined up, but that is just the perfect place, I think, for us to end because we're at an hour. Um, Katie, this has been such a pleasure, and it's so great to talk to you again after all this time.
It's
I
great
hope
to
you
talk to you too.
I hope you'll come back when your new book comes out. And so tell us a little bit before we go about the new book. I'm going to put up your website here on the screen so people can check you out. So when does it come out? And can we pre-order and tell us more?
You can pre-order, and it was the cool thing about the book. It's called Life in a Field. It was selected by Rachel Zucker, the poet I mentioned earlier, who is one of the poets of my generation who's written. Rachel Zucker has written beautifully about motherhood. So has Katie Ford, who has written into the chat and is a very long time friend of mine. Katie has also written beautiful poems about motherhood. So Rachel chose the book for the Omnidon Open Books Prize, and it's the publication date is April 1st, 2021, when I'm sure we're all still going to be living in our houses. So I bet I'll also probably have a virtual book launch. And the cool thing about this book is I wrote it in the aftermath of a pregnancy that I lost in 2015. But it's a fable. It doesn't directly treat that topic, but I wrote it as a consolation to myself, feeling like I was living in a world I didn't want to live in, right? That was my sense. And I wanted to write a book. The question that echoes through it is, what do you do with the world you didn't wish for? You know?
Mm.
And it's a story written in these small prose poem paragraphs. And it's accompanied by 4 folios of photographs taken by Young.
Mm.
So as you move through the 4 sections of the book, you also move through these folios of photographs taken by Young and arranged by both of us. And there are these 2 characters, this girl and this donkey, and it's just about them learning to understand each other.
That sounds beautiful. I want to
Yeah.
read that right away. I will be pre-ordering. When will
Yeah,
it be available for pre-order?
go get
Or
it.
if
You can pre-order it now on Bookshop and lots of other places wherever
okay.
books are sold. And they've done a beautiful job with it at Omnidon. It's just the book layout is stunning, and Young's photos are in full color in the book, which is unexpected and wonderful. So please do.
Yes, everyone, please. You heard it here. Maybe not first, but you know, you heard it here. Go buy it now, April 2021, and we'll be back at your launch party, and then
Great.
have you back when it comes out. But thank you so much again for joining me tonight and for your honest and thoughtful conversation.
It's been so
Um,
great to talk to you about animals, and congratulations on all the attention your book is
oh,
receiving. I loved reading it myself.
thank you, Katie. You know I'm a fan of your work too. And thank you all for tuning in. So you can watch this video again, listen to the episode as a podcast, or read the interview transcript sometime a little later this week at your leisure, all on writermothermonster.com. We'll put that up on the screen. And again, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider becoming a patron or patroness on Patreon. And that link is also there on the website. So thank you so much. And we don't have an episode next week for Thanksgiving. So enjoy Thanksgiving, and you as well, Katie, and have a good holiday. And then we'll see you again soon.